Tube amp repair shop. We'll get back to doing our conversion from the printed circuit board to the point-to-point wiring on the Fender Champion 600 a little bit. Right now we have up on the bench a purple Fender Pro Junior III, so we can see. And that's what it says, Pro Junior III. So interestingly enough, this one only has a couple of knobs, the light, the power switch, and an input jack. The complaint from the customer is that it intermittently goes out. So we're going to take a look inside and see what we can find. Grab a new parts bag. When you take things apart, I like to keep everything in a bag so get back to it later, especially if I have a couple different projects on the desk. When you take apart some of the Fender amps, they have the metal cage. You don't need to remove the two bottom screws. Those just hold the cage to the back panel. I'll take out these other ones to remove the back panel. See what's happening. What I expect to find is 3 to 4 capacitors, 2 EL84 power tubes, the circuit board, and these amps, for the most part, pretty carefree when you do maintenance on them. The thing that I found is useful is to upgrade the filter caps. They put in the Internet Chicago brand, which is a modestly priced cap. We use them sometimes if we can't get the F&T caps, but the black F&T caps are definitely my favorite. So you can get a good shot of everything while I'm working on it. So first thing I do with these guys, get rid of any dust. I don't have my little vacuum set up, so I just brush it. This thing looks like it's been parked for a while in the dust zone. Okay. That's a start anyways. Turn everything down. Didn't plug it in to listen to it yet, but I have found in general it's a good idea to plug them in and listen to them. We already know where these fail most of the time. As you can see, I'm moving this little plate around. What happens with the EL84 tubes and this little tube retainer is when people put the cable in, it pushes the tubes over, and then sometimes the pin that supplies bias to the EL84 doesn't make a good connection. They run too hot, which can either burn out the tubes, or they'll stop making sound when people play them for a while because they get hot. Checking my AC. This is with the amp off. I always like to check to make sure that my AC is coming in. I have a multimeter that I just leave hooked up to the variac, almost 120 volts, just right under it. There's the variac, and that's the current limiter. And if you can see the silver switch on the right, that's in current limiter mode. That way when I turn it on, if there's a lot of current being drawn, the light bulb will turn on. So I'm powering up the amp. I can see the little blue jewel is glowing. That's a good thing. And I have my handy test signal. Use a test signal generator. It's a 1 kilohertz tone at 250 millivolts. Pretty much, it's a very small input signal. It's similar to what a guitar will put out, but the tone is steady state, so it's nice. You can check an amp that way. See if We can tell right away that the potentiometers are dirty, so things will be fixing. And when I look at it over here, I see one tube lighting up, and I don't really see the other tube lighting up. So that's probably the cause. Hopefully it shows up in the camera there that one EL84 is glowing and one of them looks dark. A lot of this time this means that, well, unless the tube is completely dead, which happens sometimes, usually means that something in the ribbon cable or the circuit board with the socket are not allowing the 3.5 volts to go in and turn on the heater. So looks like in this design there's two 12AX7s and two L34s. Moving around the other tube a little bit to see. So given that the EL34 is dark, we know that that's the problem. I'm going to turn off the current limiter. It's full power. The 120 volts going into the amp now. I still don't see any heater current on the right hand EL84. So I'm going to go ahead and power down. I turned it off at the variac. And before I change the capacitors, we're going to change these three capacitors up here. There's 222s, 222 microfarads, and the third one over here on the right is a 47. Pretty standard values. Just in the bigger amps, you have more of them. So on this particular tube, let's see if we get a good view of it in the camera, we can see that pins 4 and 5 are the heaters. So I'm going to reach inside the amplifier, which I have to make sure that it's switched on. I'm turning it back on. And then behind these ribbon cables, while they're still in place, I can reach inside and see if the heaters are showing up. So I've hooked up my multimeter. I'm using a bench type multimeter. I'm sorry, I can see the numbers are rolling a little bit on the screen when I do it. On the frame of the chassis, I have a green alligator clip, and that goes to the black lead on the multimeter. And I'm measuring. We looked up on the tube pinout image that pins 4 and 5 have the heaters 3.5 volts each, which make the 6 volts. When you're looking at a tube socket from the bottom, you go clockwise, and when you look at a tube socket from the top, you go counterclockwise. These tubes are facing down, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I can see that on the first tube, I take it out of current limiter, I've got my 3.5 volts, 3.42, close enough. And then I'm reaching under this ribbon cable so I can get to the pins of second tube, 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, I have my AC 3.5 volts on both pins 4 and 5. So I'm suspecting that the tube is actually dead. I have a tube tester, but just very quickly what I'm going to do is switch the two tubes, take the cover, take the little spring retainer off for a minute while we're doing this, switch and see if the problem follows the tube. So we can determine whether it's a socket problem or a tube problem. And we'll use the tester in a minute after that. These are JJ EL84s. Pretty good stuff. I like JJ tubes. Yeah, so the one on the right, I moved it over and the heater is coming. And the one on the left, the heater is not working. So it's fair and reasonable to assume that that tube is dead. And I'll save these for the client. I'll go measure this JJ. If you look at the colors on these tubes, you can see that they're very white, and the ink should be orange or red. And they're, I would say, in typical, that when you see them like this, it means they've been running way too hot, and it burns the paint, so to speak. So let me set these tubes aside, and I'll go grab a fresh pair of tubes. Alright, so we have two brand new EL84s, also JJ brand. Take a look at the ink on them. Sometimes it's helpful when you look at a tube. It's true you have to measure them in some way, but when they're actually all burnt up, a lot of times where the ink has changed colors, etc., you just know that there's a problem, etc. So here we can see that the proper color for these tubes is an orange or red color. Okay, so I put the new tubes in, and hopefully you can see they're both of them glowing orange. So I don't suspect that it's a problem with the circuit board. So work continues on this Pro Junior III. This apparently is version 1. It's only got the 2 knobs. When I use the bias probes to see how much current it was drawing, they're up at a whopping 45 millivolts. And that's the reason the other tubes burnt up. Inside of this amp from the factory, it just has the one little resistor. You can see it's still attached, hopefully, in the picture here, next to the little blue square, which is the bias potentiometer trim pot that I put in there. Now that we have a trim pot, I'm able to turn it down, and we're able to get 25 millivolts, which is correct. We had 400 plus voltage on the plates, and then you take the desired watts that you want to end up with and divide. So the way I do it is I use a chart. Let's see if we get a good picture of it here. This is a very good chart. It came with the bias probe. It was CompuBias, which was a great company. They made a probe that showed you watts. You could do 2 tubes at a time and see your plate voltage, the current being drawn, and the watts. It had a little computer in it, which was fabulous. Unfortunately, it didn't endure, and the people that made it are no longer around. I'm getting my chopstick out so I can point. But I like their chart because it shows the low value in this column of what will work, and the high value. 70%, like it says here, is typically, from any tube that you're using, for guitars anyways, the sweet spot. Turn it up loud enough to sound great, but not too high, and then you have good tube life. So then we have all the different kinds of tubes on the left. In this case, we're using the EL84s. So again, I hope will show up in the video. EL84s. And the maximum rated wattage of that tube is 12 watts. So at the 70%, our goal is to set the current to produce 8 watts. And the way we do that, power on my Variac, my tube current limiter is set to bypass, so the amp will receive full line current. Look at my small multimeter, and we can see that we've got basically 120, 119, let's see, yeah, 119 volts, which is right there next to 120, and that's typically what's coming out of wall sockets these days. Sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower. Okay, so now the amp is on. You can see the little blue indicator is lit up, and we're going to use my large multimeter. I don't know if the numbers stay screen on my camera. It looks like they move from side to side, but hopefully we get a good shot of it. Anyways, I'll read the results to you. Got my negative probe. When I'm dealing with the high voltage in amps, to be safe, and also because I believe I get a better reading, take the black probe, put put an alligator clip. I like green because green stands for ground most of the time. Alright, at least in household appliances the wire is green. And now, setting my multimeter on DC, it's already there, and I'm going to use the red probe to go to pin number 7, which is the plate on the tube, and that will show our high voltage. So our high voltage, and hopefully it's showing up clearly for you there, is 317, and it's the same on both tubes. Yep, 317. Okay, so now we're going to plug in the bias probes, and I have the correct fixtures that accommodate the EL84s, and this red and black wire comes over here. Alright, and now we can see, trying to get a good shot of it here, as a result of putting in the potentiometer, that's the first tube and that's the second tube. See, they're right at 25. And the way I came up with that number, use the calculator, we have desired watts, which is 8, divided by the plate voltage, which is 319, equals, and then you can see here it says 0.025, and the 25 is the milliamps. So we used the desired watts, 8, divided by the plate voltage is the milliamps. And then we can turn up the little potentiometer to make adjustments. And there's a little potentiometer here. So everything works. I've already tested it. I just wanted to include it in the video so people could see what I was doing. I'm going to basically leave it set up with the bias probe. The next thing I'm going to do is take the circuit board out of the amp again and drill some little holes in it so I can make a very neat install with a little potentiometer. I have to be careful not to go through any traces, but I think it'll work just fine. I've done this kind of thing before. So I'll go back to recording in a minute once I've got it installed and show you what it looks like. And a quick note, I'm hoping this will show up adequately on the screen. Let's see if I can get close to it. Getting my chopstick out so I can point. This is the part of the schematic over here that deals with the bias. And it turns out that this one, R30, is the last thing that goes out and feeds X. And X is this point that's feeding into the two tubes. It does go through another pair of resistors that are each 220. But X exits over here and enters over here, and then sends the bias to the tube to help keep it cool, set how brightly it will burn. And so before I made the change, I did measure it, and it is pretty much negative 10.4, which is what it says on the schematic, but my tubes were running at 40 millivolts or 45 millivolts, which was too high. So I've added the small potentiometer after the resistor. It adds a little more resistance, and then the result is we can bring it back down to 25 milliwatts where it's safe for the tube to operate. So that took a little bit of effort to pull the board out and drill holes in it, and there are 3 terminals on the little bias probe. I cut off the one that I'm not using. I put one end through the hole that the resistor had to continue the circuit. I drilled a hole in the plastic where there was no connection for the other pin, so the little potentiometer will mount flush against the board. And then on the top resistor, I moved it closer to the circuit board and then used a small wire to go from the top of the board to the bottom, and it's connected to the other terminal of the bias pot. Looks like it worked perfectly. After doing all that, I didn't break it. We still got 25 milliamps on the first tube, 25 milliamps on the second tube. So I'm going to take out my probes and get ready to close it up. This project is coming along nicely. When I'm done with the new FNT filter caps, it should run very quiet, provide great DC for the plates of the preamp and power tubes. And now that we can adjust the bias anytime in the future that the power tubes are swapped, we can dial them into a desired reading. So anyway, we've got it all put back together, and plugged a guitar in. It's an Ibanez Steve I model. I like this guitar for testing amps. I'm on the neck pickup. Pickup. Amp is set at about 2, tone halfway up. It says Pro Junior III, version 1. All set to go, ready for the customer to pick up. Bias pot installed, new tubes, bias set, new FNT filter caps. Sounds great. Very clean, very quiet, good resolution. I'm happy with the project. If you'd like help with your amp, you need tubes or other service, please call Eric at tubeamprepairshop.com, area code 818-645-1075. Thank you, and have a nice day.